There are behaviors that speak louder than 1,000 words. Certain gestures, attitudes, and silent insistences hide an obsession disguised as attention. When someone crosses the line from healthy interest into the unconscious, the signs begin to reveal themselves. But how can you recognize when this is happening? What lies behind repetitive, seemingly harmless actions that actually signal a deep and often unconscious fixation? In this video, we'll dive into the hidden signs of a camouflaged obsession through the lens of Carl Jung's concepts. Drawing on analytical psychology, we'll uncover what certain behavioral patterns really mean and what they say about the person exhibiting them. Get ready to see beyond appearances and understand the unconscious forces at work in human relationships. If you've ever felt that something's off in the way they act, comment, "I trust my intuition." According to Carl Jung, human behavior is guided by unconscious forces that often escape rational perception. When someone displays persistent signs of exaggerated attention, constant presence, and excessive interest, it's likely not just infatuation, but a projection of their own unconscious onto another. In this context, obsession is less about the other person and more about a hidden part of the one who feels it. Jung described projection as the tendency to attribute to others inner contents that haven't yet been recognized or integrated into our own psyche. This means that when someone insists on remaining intensely present in your life, they may unconsciously be seeking in you something they've lost in themselves or something they never dared to face. The shadow, a central concept in Jungian psychology, represents all the repressed or unacknowledged aspects of our being. A person who appears obsessive may, without realizing it, be projecting this shadow onto you, attempting to connect with what it represents. The intensity of this fixation reveals how loudly that repressed part is clamoring for attention and acknowledgement. Moreover, the unconscious drive toward individuation, the process of becoming whole, can lead someone to see in another person a complementary figure, the animus or anima, the inner masculine and feminine qualities we seek to integrate. When this process remains unconscious, it can manifest as blind passion, fixation, or emotional dependence. Viewing these signs through a Jungian lens allows us to identify when interest stops being healthy and instead reflects an unconscious imbalance of the soul. In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, projection plays a central role in how we relate to others. Projection is the unconscious act of attributing to someone else traits, feelings, or desires that actually belong to us but haven't yet been integrated into our consciousness. In relationships marked by excessive emotional intensity, this dynamic is especially evident. Obsession, in this framework, can be understood as an extreme form of projection in which the other person becomes a distorted mirror of one's unrecognized psychic contents. When someone exhibits repetitive, overly attentive, insistent, or even invasive behaviors, they may be projecting something of themselves onto the other, something that could be a repressed desire, a deep emotional need, an idealized affection, or even a fragment of identity that was broken apart over time. Constant presence, exaggerated gestures, and an inability to step back aren't simply signs of affection, but rather an unconscious quest to reconnect with lost parts of the self. For Jung, the other person isn't just an autonomous being, but also a symbolic field in which our unconscious can manifest. In other words, the more someone is unaware of their own emotions, desires, and traumas, the more likely they are to see these elements mirrored in the behavior and presence of another. This is how obsession is born, when a person stops seeing who you really are and begins reacting to the symbolic image they projected onto you. This mechanism can be mistaken for healthy passion, but the essential difference is that genuine passion recognizes the other as distinct, while obsession erases that otherness, treating the person as an extension of an internal drama. The obsessive individual is often not in love with you, but with what you represent in their unconscious narrative. You might be perceived as a savior, a mirror, an idealized parental figure, or the embodiment of something they feel they lack. The power of this projection is such that, even in the face of rejection, absence, or disinterest, the obsessive behavior persists. That's because what's being fed is not the relationship itself, but the bond with the projected image. It's as if the psyche says, "I must keep this person close because they connect me to a part of myself I can't lose." Thus, Every repeated gesture, every attempt at closeness, every fixed stare is actually an effort to sustain an unconscious illusion. The most dangerous aspect of this dynamic is that it can turn into a vicious cycle. The person on the receiving end, especially if they have their own emotional wounds, may feel validated, desired, or important because of the other's intensity. Yet over time, they'll realize that this intensity doesn't come from a healthy place. It pressures, it suffocates, it demands. And when they try to pull away, the obsessive behavior often intensifies because the other's unconscious reacts as though it's losing a vital part of itself. Understanding this dynamic requires looking beyond the obvious. In the Jungian view, obsessive behavior signals that something much deeper is being triggered, something the individual hasn't dared to face within themselves. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it explains why it repeats with such force. Recognizing this pattern is the first step to emotional self-defense and to understanding what's at play on the unconscious level. Observing obsession through the lens of projection not only reveals what's happening with the other person, but also invites us to ask, have we at some point projected onto others what is missing inside ourselves? The answer to this question may be uncomfortable, but also liberating. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents everything rejected, forgotten, or repressed by consciousness. These are aspects of ourselves we deem unacceptable, shameful, or dangerous, and therefore banished to the unconscious. Yet what is repressed doesn't disappear. It works silently, seeking expression. In many relationships, the shadow disguises itself as love and returns as obsession. What seems like an intense, all-consuming bond may actually be an unconscious attempt to reconnect with these lost parts of ourselves. When someone fixates on another person, showing an uncontrollable desire for closeness, control, or fusion, that figure may be serving as a channel for the shadow's expression. The other is seen as someone who awakens what we've internally denied, as though holding a key to a psychic territory long locked away. In this case, the object of obsession isn't loved for who they are, but for what they symbolize to the unconscious, a bridge to reconciliation with what was rejected. Obsession often brings contradictory feelings: desire and anger, admiration and resentment, need and guilt. This ambivalence is typical of the shadow relationship, for it contains both creative potentials and destructive contents. When projected onto another, it can generate fascination, but also a sense of threat. The obsessive person wants to possess, but also fears what this figure evokes. And the harder they try to control the other, the more they reveal their own fear of facing themselves. Jung taught that the shadow isn't just the dark side of personality. It also contains essential elements for wholeness, talents, legitimate desires, and vital impulses that were denied out of fear, shame, or social pressure. Obsession often arises when part of this shadow is activated by someone who brings those repressed contents to the surface. Instead of integrating these parts into consciousness, the individual projects them onto the other, unconsciously seeking proximity to their own essence through that person. That's why many obsessive relationships have an almost mystical aura, as if the other wields a special power over the one who feels it. This power actually comes from the unconscious. The other embodies the shadow, bringing up emotions long kept under control. This encounter with the shadow can feel so intense that it creates the illusion of true love, when in reality it's only a reflection of what's missing within one's own psyche. The key issue here isn't the intensity of the feeling, but its origin and direction. Healthy love arises from self-acceptance and recognition of the other's alterity. Obsession, by contrast, springs from the refusal to look inward and the need to find outside what is lacking inside. The individual clings to the other as though they are the only chance to feel alive, whole, or significant. Yet, this emotional dependence actually reveals a profound disconnection from the self. Integrating the shadow, according to Jung, is a fundamental stage in individuation, the journey toward wholeness. It requires acknowledging and welcoming the personality's denied aspects rather than projecting them. When this doesn't happen, the shadow manifests in relationships in distorted ways, creating bonds based on neediness, control, and fear, rather than on freedom and authenticity. Seeing obsession as an unconscious attempt to reclaim one's own shadow changes the perspective entirely. It stops being merely an external behavior issue and becomes an inner call. The question shifts from why do they act like this to what are they unconsciously trying to rediscover in themselves through the other. Recognizing this doesn't solve everything instantly, but it opens a path for the individual to break free from the cycle of projection and begin integrating the parts still living in the shadow. Only then can love cease to be a disguise and become real. At the heart of Jung's analytical psychology lie the archetypes of Animus and anima, symbolic representations of the masculine and feminine aspects within each person, regardless of biological sex. The anima is the feminine principle in a man's psyche. The animus is the masculine principle in a woman's. Both are not simply psychological traits, but archetypal impulses toward inner completeness. When these archetypes remain unrecognized and unintegrated, they tend to be projected onto others, creating intense idealization, emotional dependence, and often obsession. When someone becomes obsessed with another, it's common that they unconsciously see in them a living manifestation of their own animus or anima. The other person ceases to be an individual with their own desires and boundaries and becomes a symbolic representation of what the soul seeks to become. The intensity of attraction, the inexplicable fascination, and the constant need for contact reveal that something deeper is at stake, an unconscious attempt to unite with one's inner archetype through the relationship. For Jung, this projection is inevitable in the early stages of psychic development. It helps us identify latent qualities within ourselves that haven't yet been fully recognized. However, when this projection crystallizes into obsession, it stalls the individuation process. The person clings to the other as though they are the sole source of completeness, forgetting that what attracts them most resides within themselves. Obsession thus becomes a clear symptom that the archetype hasn't been integrated. A man who sees in a woman all the qualities of delicacy, intuition, mystery, and sensitivity is actually projecting his own anima onto her. Likewise, a woman who perceives in a man the strength, direction, wisdom, and authority she feels lacking is projecting her animus onto him. The other person functions as an archetypal mirror, reflecting qualities not yet awakened within oneself. This type of projection breeds deep emotional dependence because the person believes they must keep the other close to stay connected to those qualities. They feel they need the other to feel alive, confident, secure, or loved. And when there's a threat of separation, the psyche reacts with desperation, as if losing a vital part of itself. That's why obsession is often accompanied by extreme jealousy, fear of abandonment, and exaggerated idealization. Behind all this intensity lies an unconscious attempt at psychic integration. Obsession indicates that the subject still lives at a symbiotic level in which the other is viewed as an extension of their soul. Until animus and anima are recognized as internal archetypes, the desire for fusion with another will be mistaken for love when it's actually a cry for inner wholeness. Integrating animus or anima requires courage and self-knowledge. It means looking inward, identifying these qualities within oneself and consciously developing them. A man who projects his anima must learn to welcome his emotions, cultivate sensitivity, and embrace vulnerability. A woman who projects her animus needs to strengthen autonomy, critical reasoning, decision-making, and internal leadership. This inner work allows the relationship to shift from a search for salvation to an encounter between two whole individuals rather than two needy halves. Over time, as individuation advances, the other person stops being idealized and begins to be seen as they truly are. Obsession dissolves, giving way to genuine love, one that recognizes the other as a distinct being who chooses to be by one's side, not as a missing piece of one's inner puzzle. This mature, free, and true love arises from uniting internal polarities and overcoming the need to complete oneself externally. Obsession with another, therefore, is a symptom of a soul crying out for balance. Only by turning inward can this cry be answered. The process of individuation, central to Carl Jung's analytical psychology, is the path by which an individual becomes their full, authentic self. It involves an internal movement of integrating psychic opposites, conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, animus and anima, to build a coherent, integrated identity. However, when this process is interrupted or neglected, especially by an affective dependency disguised as love, a relationship can become a field of intense projections in which obsession takes the place of genuine connection. Obsessive loves are marked by excess presence, control, expectations, and idealization. The boundary between two individuals' identities dissolves, and the other person is seen not as someone with their own will, but as an extension of one's own need. The relationship ceases to be a space for mutual growth and becomes a territory of psychic capture. Recognizing when this occurs is crucial to reclaiming emotional integrity. The first sign of obsessive love is an inability to tolerate absence. Physical, emotional, or symbolic distance from the other triggers extreme anguish, as if an internal collapse is occurring. This pain isn't mere longing, but a reflection of disconnection from the self. The other's absence reactivates a void always present, but masked by the illusion that the bond would fill every gap. This is the trap of obsession, using the other as an anesthetic for a pain that only an inner journey can heal. Another indicator is the constant attempt to control the relationship's narrative. The obsessive person wants to know where the other is, who they're talking to, what they feel, what they think. They believe that more information equals more security. But this quest for control arises from the fear of losing the projection's object, because losing them would unconsciously mean losing contact with a part of themselves not yet integrated. This level of vigilance and anxiety reveals internal imbalance, masked as false care or idealized passion. Within the logic of individuation, loving means respecting the other's alterity and recognizing one's own incompleteness without depending on someone else to fill it. Obsession, on the other hand, ignores this reality and turns love into a constant demand. The other must be present, must respond, must continually reaffirm their affection, must guarantee their presence. This exhausts the relationship and stifles both parties' growth, for no one thrives in the prison of another's desire. Dealing with obsessive love first requires acknowledging that the root problem lies within oneself, not solely in the other's behavior. Even if the other reinforces this dynamic for their own unconscious reasons, as often happens in symbiotic relationships, the responsibility for one's own healing is always personal. The first step is withdrawing the projection, realizing that what we seek in another is actually a forgotten part of ourselves. This process can be painful. Withdrawing projection confronts the void it once concealed. Yet it's precisely this confrontation that births the new self, more conscious, less dependent, more whole. By recognizing that the other person isn't obligated to fill our inner world, we stop imprisoning them within unrealistic expectations that only breed frustration and resentment. Additionally, setting boundaries is essential. A boundary isn't a barrier against the other, but a protection of one's individuality. Saying no to invasive behavior, excessive expectations, or emotional control is saying yes to personal integrity. For the one on the receiving end of obsession, realizing they're the target of projection can be difficult, but is vital to avoid getting lost in the other's psychic entanglement. Healing from obsessive love isn't merely about cutting ties, but about deep awareness of what that bond represents. The relationship may continue if both parties transform, but it will only be healthy when there's room for each to be whole within themselves. Therefore, recognizing the signs, embracing the pain of the void, and moving toward integration are the three pillars supporting the transcendence of obsessive love. Only then does the relationship cease to be a prison and become a true encounter. Relationships are living mirrors of our souls. When obsession infiltrates under the guise of love, it is the unconscious speaking, crying out for integration, recognition, and healing. Jungian analytical psychology teaches that behind every too intense bond lies a profound invitation to individuation. The other isn't there to complete us, but to show us with symbolic precision what remains undiscovered within ourselves. Recognizing projection, embracing the shadow, integrating internal archetypes, and establishing healthy boundaries are steps that set us free. Only then can love bloom as a choice, not a prison. Obsession loses its power when we awaken to our own wholeness. And in that awakening, the true encounter is born, between two whole beings who see each other not as mutual salvation, but as conscious companions on life's journey. If this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel for more deep reflections through the lens of Jung and the human soul. And now, watch the video on your screen. It will further expand your understanding of the unconscious and emotional bonds. Transformation begins when you choose to look within,